So in anticipation of our summer spotlight exhibition, FLX Autochrome, we have the pleasure to hear firsthand from artist Nathan Benn. Benn photographed New York's Finger Lakes region for National Geographic in 1975, the year when the magazine reached peak circulation of 10.8 million. Tonight, we will have a sneak peek into the show that will open at the Rockwell Museum on May 29. So save the date and please come see us. And in addition to hearing about his experience in the Finger Lakes, we'll also hear from Benn about, he'll briefly discuss the evolution of color photography after 1900, a few of National Geographic's milestones in publishing history, and his own path onto the National Geographic photo staff just as he celebrated his 22nd birthday. So we are thrilled to have Nathan with us live from Brooklyn tonight. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and pass things off to Nathan.
Thank you. Thank you, first, everybody at the museum who has made this show possible and invited me to share my photographs on the walls and today, this afternoon. And I want to thank everybody who's watching for your support of the museum, and hope you will get to Corning sometime over the next few months to see the show. I'm going to go to screen share, and we will be looking at photographs. But as Brett said, I like to start off with a little historical background and context of where National Geographic and color photography was in 1975, and how I got connected to it. So this was the opening of the story as it was published in late 1976, New York's Land of Dreamers and Doers. All of the photographs were pictures that I took between May of 1975 and almost a year later. I wasn't there continuously, but I was in the Finger Lakes region for 5 or 6 months of that period. And the writer was Ethel Starbird. As I said, I'd like to start though with the context and the story of the development of the National Geographic Society. Is a family story, and I start with this couple, Alex and Mabel. Family snapshot from about 1880 in Nova Scotia. This is Alexander Graham Bell and his wife, Mabel Hubbard, and their 2 oldest children. The girl on the right is Elsie, and we will see her more later because she is quite involved with the story. This is Mabel, Mrs. Bell, later in life. Mrs. Bell was the daughter of Gardner Green Bell, who's a very successful Boston attorney who plays a role. And Mabel is completely deaf. And Alexander Bell fell in love with Mabel Hubbard, this completely deaf woman who was deaf like Alexander Graham Bell's mother was also totally deaf. The deafness of his mother and his wife and the community inspired Bell to focus his talent as an inventor in trying to find devices that would help people with hearing issues to be able to hear. And in his experiments, in his development of hearing devices, a side product was inventing the telephone. There had been other attempts. There was work also going on in Europe on doing telephonic devices, but nobody had really commercialized it. Nobody had a patent for it yet. So Bell improved it and was awarded the first patent for the telephone. And then working with his father-in-law, Gardner Green Hubbard, they created a little startup, which was named American Telephone and Telegraph, became widely known as the Bell System, and is today known as AT&T. This brought vast wealth to both families. And by the 1880s, they could do what they wanted and express their interest in things. And one of their interests, and that was popular in, this Victorian period, was the exploration of the world. Much of the world was still unexplored by Westerners. And the National Geographic Society was 40 gentlemen who gathered, founded the organization as a not-for-profit for the purpose of exploration and the dissemination of knowledge and geographical information. They met at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., and in 1888 chartered the National Geographic Society. Very soon, the first publication was issued, no photographs, because at this point, 1888, reproducing photography in printing, mass printing, was in the future, was still in the future. But the first issue of National Geographic magazine was published in 1888. Young man went to work for the magazine and married that little girl, Elsie Bell, the daughter of Alexander and Mabel Bell. And his name was Gilbert Hovey Grosvenor. And he went to work as the National Geographic as a young man, and he was a pretty enterprising entrepreneur. This was Gilbert, Hovey, and Elsie, towards the end of their life and towards the end of Gilbert's leadership of the National Geographic Society. Gilbert was named the editor of National Geographic magazine in 1899, and he stepped down in 1954. So he was the editor for 55 years, so more than the entire first half of the 20th century. In 1906, National Geographic published the first full black and white photographs in a magazine, one of many milestones that were unique to National Geographic. So that was in 1906. Photographs were a big boost to circulation. When Gilbert became the editor, there were only a few thousand members of National Geographic. When he retired in 1954, there were more than 5 million. In that period, a Frenchman, Louis Lumière, invented a process, the first successful process really for photographing in color. Chemists, inventors, from the very beginning of the invention of photography in 1838, people were trying to find ways to take photographs in color. And there were some not so satisfactory processes played within the 19th century, but the first successful process commercially and of good quality was Lumière's process, which involved potato starch and dyes at that point on glass plates. The process was called Autochrome, and Autochrome was responsible for more than 90% of the color photographs published in National Geographic into the late 1930s. So it had a very long life as an early color process. In 1914, the magazine is still principally black and white, using a lot more photographs, but published the first color photographs ever published in a magazine or any publication. And it's quite remarkable. These would have been taken then on glass plates, and this was, in the first issue of color photographs in July 1914. And the photograph on the right is still a breathtakingly beautiful photograph by any standard. I would have been very proud to have taken that. Innovation continued, and Longley and Martin in the Keys of South Florida made the first color underwater photographs in 1926. This color process, still working with Autochrome, the material was very slow, meaning it required a lot of light to make the exposure. And so in order to get enough light, the photographers detonated phosphate bombs just above the reefs. The fish don't look scared here. I suspect they were probably startled, but these were in that first group of color photographs ever published. A few years later, a young man named Melville Bell Grosvenor took the first color aerial photograph. That was published, of course, Statue of Liberty. Melville Bell in the 30s then went on to serve a number of years as a Navy officer. There's a picture, I think it may be obscured somewhat by the panel on the right, but that's Gilbert Hovey holding his elder son, Melville Bell Grosvenor. In 1932, the Autochrome was still the standard for color. Most of the photography was still black and white because the film was slow and the equipment bulky. The photography, color photography at that time was stilted. And we look at the photographs today and they lack spontaneity, they lack a sense of authenticity. Obviously, the photographer's working on a tripod with a cooperative subject. And now I introduce a couple of professional musicians, both named Leopold, but unrelated. Mr. Godowski on the left playing the violin. He's playing a Guarneri violin, in fact, and he's an accomplished violinist and happens to be married to the sister of George and Ira Gershwin. Monish is a concert pianist. So why do these musicians fit into our story? Well, because they were also tinkerers. And they had a basement darkroom and lab, and they tinkered around with color processes. And they invented Kodachrome, what became known as Kodachrome, after George Eastman licensed the process from them. And in 1936, the Eastman Kodak Company introduced commercially Kodachrome film, both in 35 millimeter format and in sheet films. This changed the world of photography, especially color photography. And it coincided with the popularization of these miniature cameras. 35 millimeter film was being produced from the early 20th century for use as a cinema film. And a fellow named Ernst Leitz in Germany in the early 20th century tinkered with the idea of using this cinema film to make still photographs in a small camera. The idea caught on, and the Leica company is still very much in business and very distinguished. And Kodachrome 35 millimeter was a very, very good fit for Leica. By the beginning of World War II, National Geographic, Gilbert Grosvenor, still as the editor from the original editor from 1899, was still very much a black and white magazine, but was increasingly using color. And this would have been, this is a 35 millimeter Kodachrome picture. In this period, National Geographic, when they published color photographs, would give credit to the photographer, but would also give credit to the film, because this was rocket science. This was the idea of shooting pictures, color photographs spontaneously at high shutter speeds with a miniature camera was really, more innovative than the iPhone 13 at this moment. So, under the picture it says Kodachrome by, and then the name of the photographer. But much of the photography in National Geographic in the 40s and early 50s was still very stagey. Much of it was shot still with very large format cameras and would require a truck full of lights. It was not uncommon for a National Geographic photographer, if he was going to be shooting indoors, would be accompanied by one or two lighting technicians and a truck full of lighting equipment, because they had to be produced as Hollywood movies in the 1950s were produced with a lot of extra lighting. And like the Technicolor movies of the early 50s, I think the goal was to use all of the primary colors that they could in each picture. But these miniature cameras, these are Leicas, were catching on with certain people. The fellow in the hat on the left was a pretty good photographer. He did some work in the United States, introduced himself in the United States as Hank Carter. Back in France, he was better known as Henri Cartier-Bresson. The lady, a fashionable lady on the right with a Leica M3 is an amateur photographer, but her day job at the time was that she was the Queen of England and still is. The next revolution in photography technology was the introduction of the Nikon camera system. Nikon was a Japanese company founded in the early 20th century to make telescopes and microscopes during and binoculars during World War II. They were the makers of periscopes for the Japanese Navy. After World War II, the demand for Japanese submarine periscopes dwindled, and they refocused their business on making photographic equipment, first rangefinder cameras that were very similar to the Leicas. But in 1959, they introduced the greatest machine, a Nikon. I mean, this is like the Porsche 911 of photography. It never went out of style. It was built tough and very flexible and a great pleasure to use. A titanium shutter. And it was part of, it was not just a camera and a lens, it was a camera system. And you could put lenses from very wide angles to extreme telephotos, motor drives, and various devices to solve any photographic problem. And this became very quickly in the 60s the standard for photo gear for National Geographic and basically all photojournalism. I mean, Nikon owned the market. Start talking about closer to home, my own development. I was born in downtown Miami in 1950. My mom and grew up with a lot of television. We didn't travel. We were a pretty modest family, and we didn't have the flexibility to travel. But I dreamt about traveling. I was very interested in wanting to travel, and I also was very influenced by Life magazine. Life magazine was lavishly large and it was all pictures. Henry Luce was the producer of Life, the publisher of Life magazine. It was his invention. It came out in the late 1930s, always as a picture-driven magazine. As a Time magazine was authoritative, very conservative, but tried to be authoritative. It was primarily text. Life was the pictorial complement to that. And Life really set the horizon, set the anybody who was interested in being a photojournalist, your aspirations were created by Life magazine. By the time I was 15 years old, I had the foolish aspiration, foolish because it was unlikely to be able to succeed at this, to become a magazine photographer. And I was photographing as a teenager for the school yearbook, and then the community newspaper that was able to get me a summer job at the Miami News, which was a very distinguished daily newspaper, where I learned a lot and put in my first 10,000 hours of trying to learn how to control the equipment, work in a variety of light, and compose a photograph. And with a tolerant and helpful colleagues, I improved my skills. My work during summers as interns for the Miami News for 2 summers, and then 1 summer in Palm Beach for another paper, caught the attention of Bob Gilka, the director of National Geographic. Bob was a very square guy. He was from Minnesota and wore a crew cut, and he looked like he, in another life, he would have been a Marine drill sergeant. But he started as a young man as an editor at the National Geographic. Soon became, in the 1960s, was promoted to become the director of photography. And he remade the staff of the Geographic, the contributors, and the look of the magazine completely, in association with a brilliant contemporary editor of his, Bill Garrett. And the two of them changed the National Geographic and brought it into the 20th century, late 20th century. He also changed my life because he liked my photographs. And I started there as a summer internship. There he had 3 summer interns each summer out of 200 people trying to get that job. So I was very lucky. I'm sure most of them were more talented than I was, but for some reason, Bob Gilka took a shine to me. Early assignment was to send me back to Miami, my hometown, to photograph the Cuban exiles, people who had left Cuba soon after Castro came in, and had developed a new and very successful middle class in Miami at that point, and now really are the dominant political, economic power engine of South Florida. I worked as a contract photographer on the photo staff for the next 19 years for the National Geographic. Had 30 titles, byline titles in the magazine over that period, and also contributed to many books that were published by the National Geographic. I did occasional work outside of the Geographic, but I was full-time, really working full-time for the Geographic. I had 1 cover in that period. I would have liked to have had 5 covers in that period, but I had 1 cover, and very uncharacteristic for me. It was a picture of a boat 200 miles off of Newfoundland. I won't get into why I was there, and I really hate being on boats, so it was quite a quirk. Right after the Cuban story, my next story was on the state of Vermont. Growing up in Miami and hardly ever traveling, going to Vermont for me was alien. It was like I had landed on a different planet. The landscape is very different from South Florida. The people claim to speak English, but it's heavily accented and at times hard to understand, but I got by. And it was also, even though it was 1973 when I started shooting there, they still had many of the traditions and lifestyles and economics of the early 20th century or 19th century. And it was easy to find highly picturesque scenes and highly picturesque people. This young woman was a cook at a commune. Vermont had attracted many what was at the time called hippies to sharing homes and work, and it was the very origin of what has become a very widespread interest in sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture and responsible environmental stewardship. She's just standing outside of the kitchen door of the commune, calling the other members to dinner. Blacksmith, Leo Carrier the farrier. sugar hut, maple sugar, maple syrup was is a big product, still is in Vermont. Maple sap is tapped from trees and then boiled down in these sugar huts. And some of this still goes on. This is very small scale. Auctioning a farm, breaking up an old family farm. And the auctioneer showing the teeth, supposedly useful information if you're thinking about buying this cow. And a barnyard. So Vermont was a very successful story. The editors liked it. They gave it 40 pages in the magazine. They really liked what I did with it. And I was, I think that, well, I know that, my interest was always photographing people. And I, for whatever reason, seemed to be unintimidating and usually found a way to work around situations without interrupting and setting up situations. And it was very, it worked very well in Vermont. Immediately after Vermont, the writer of the Vermont story and I were assigned to photograph the Finger Lakes. And it seemed logical because we had done a good job in Vermont. Finger Lakes seemed like a logical next step. But it was extremely different, even though you could drive from the Finger Lakes to Vermont, as I did a couple of weeks ago, in about 5 hours. The feeling was completely different. But over the next 12 months, I made multiple trips, again, cumulatively 5 or 6 trips or 5 or 6 months cumulatively to Vermont. Shot 383 rolls of film, which means almost 14,000 photographs. Over the last 20 years, I've edited my pictures very severely and only kept pictures that I really liked. So now I still have about 100 photographs of the Finger Lakes. Most of those 14,000 pictures were redundant or, completely unsuccessful. But the key is to try to separate the ones that are good and focus on that. Now, how does a photographer, let me go back to this slide. I wasn't, in being assigned the Finger Lakes, as if it would be the same situation as being assigned Vermont or Miami Cubans or go photograph South Korea or the Mississippi River. You'd get a small slip of paper typed out, Nathan, please prepare to photograph the Finger Lakes. The editor is Al Royce, signed Bob Gilka. And that's your assignment. The rest was up to you. This is ultimate freedom. And the Geographic had a huge expense account. I mean, they were making lots of money. They had almost 11 million subscribers. And the attitude was just the cost of producing the photographs was insignificant given the scale of the publishing and the cost of production and producing 11 million magazines and sending them out. So we were given generous time in the field and a lot of rope to hang ourselves if we didn't do well, because if we didn't do well, then the expectation was that the photographer was responsible. I couldn't blame anybody else telling me what to do and giving me bad information. It was my job to do the research, plan my schedule. And each of my assignments over 20 years started the same way. I would pack up my gear in Washington, in 6 or 8 or 10 aluminum Halliburton cases, maybe 5 cameras and 10 lenses, and a couple hundred rolls of film, and fly off to my destination, check into a hotel, unpack, hang up my clothes, and then sit on the bed terrified, like, what am I supposed to do next? Because nobody's telling you where to go. It's all up to you. So in my working method, and I think this applied to many of my colleagues, would be to kind of try to organize you into what would be the principal themes for any project. And in the case of the Finger Lakes, it's a regional story for National Geographic, and regional stories were bread and butter at National Geographic. I don't think they've done them for years, but back then, every month there would be some regional American story, often a state or a river. In this case, the Finger Lakes. So because it's geographic, you have to get geography photographs, and geography was always, for me, the most difficult. The Finger Lakes had the benefit of having good roads near the lakes and some nice hills. And in the fall, on a clear day, you could get a view. But my default for doing landscape, whenever I could, would be to hire an airplane. When helicopters were available, I'd always prefer a helicopter. But in the Finger Lakes in 1975, there weren't any commercially available helicopters. So my shooting platform would usually be a Cessna 150 or 170 with the door taken off on my side and strapped in. And then it would give enough elevation so you have some dimension to the landscape. But it was always a struggle for me to get the landscape pictures, the geography pictures that were adequate for the coverage. Industry was different. I loved photographing industry. I loved watching stuff made. Growing up in Miami, I mean, nobody made stuff. It was not. Miami is not an industrial city in terms of manufacturing, but the Finger Lakes had a few industries. They were making fire engines in Elmira, and rope in Auburn. This is an old 19th century company now. I think the fire engine companies, American LaFrance, are gone. The Auburn rope company, I think it was called Associated Rope or something, in Auburn is gone. But of course, Corning was the defining industry. And I just loved working in the hot shops. I spent several days. Now, at this time, the photographic film was still limited. You could light. A few years earlier, National Geographic would have brought in a lighting crew, and if I had wanted to, I could have had a lighting crew come in and light up the hot shop. But I wanted to photograph available light. It's always more satisfying if I could pull it off in available light. But the film speed, by today's standards, was very slow, and so it was a challenge. And you have to allow that most of the details go into the dark, but providing a chiaroscuro effect. Much of the hot shop was automated lines. This was Pyrex. They were making, I think the hot shop was, at least when I was there, was focused on Pyrex goods. And they were already manufacturing in other places. But they were still making Pyrex in the site that is now, I think, the Corning Museum of Glass. it was 100 and something degrees. And these hardy glass workers were used to it. I guess it was helpful to me that growing up in South Florida, I knew something about heat. And then the Stu Benn boutique was also operating, and the most photogenic part of that was this grinding, cutting. Back behind the factory, the waste glass was collected for recycling, and it was a colorful array. This was my favorite photograph from Corning because the waste glass had this unexpected jewel color, and I was hoping the Geographic would use this photograph. They didn't. They thought it would have been to be, I guess, disrespectful and to show a picture of waste rather than making stuff. But this remains my favorite photograph from that Corning take. Another picture of the waste because of the very high standards of Corning. If it wasn't perfect, I guess it got recycled. And this photograph is in the show. And my understanding is this is all gone. And this, as I said, I think that this is the site of the museum today. For me, the high point was the days working at Corning. Agriculture, of course, the focus on that was clearly grapes. Again, in the fall, there's opportunities, spent some time in the fields. And then the characters involved in grapes, the most colorful personalities at the top is Walter Taylor, whose family was Taylor of Vineyards, and then Bully Hill. And below Constantine Frank, who was developing a great advocate of pure strains, vinifera, pure strains of grapes, and did not like any hybrids. Widmer Cellars, nice aging of, I think this was Sherry Solera, I think is my recollection, in Naples, that nice sunset. Kind of another phase is, I'll just call it serendipity. Now, serendipity means you get out and you don't know what you're going to photograph, and you just have your eyes peeled and hoping you come across something. Usually you don't, but once in a while you do, and that makes it worthwhile. In a city, for me, serendipity would be typically driving or walking around a neighborhood, a couple cameras around my neck, and just walk out the hotel or some neighborhood that might be interesting, and spend many hours wandering around and not knowing what you'll run into. In the Finger Lakes, not a lot of people wandering around the sidewalks, so it was driving around. One nice summer afternoon, his family was having a little reunion and chat on their step, and it was a nice warm photograph. Came across this lady who was at this point late in her life and never married, and she was living in a large mansion in Auburn, somewhat run down, and she had been born in that house and lived there in her entire life. Beekeeper, part-time artist and beekeeper, showing off his honey. And then events. I would read every local daily and weekly newspaper or bulletin that I could read to try to pick up events that might yield some photographs. And this was a summer street festival in Penang. I think it was a Memorial Day parade. There are maybe at least 50 people in this photograph, 50 or 80 people, and it's the lack of ethnic diversity is striking. It was in 1975. It was not so different in Vermont, a little bit more diversified in Vermont, but clearly in the Finger Lakes, the idea of the community was very homogeneous. And very strong community identities and events. Montour Falls had, and I think still has, an annual volunteer firemen's contest. And as times have changed, at the time it was, I guess, I don't know that anybody protested the idea that the winner of the contest got a very big smooch from, was entitled to a big smooch from the Queen of Montour Falls. I don't think this would go over too well today. And a country house auction. And there was a religious group. The name of the group escapes me. Spiritualist, yes, the Spiritualism, Freeville Spiritualist, and this lady was a preacher at this spiritualist retreat in the summer in Freeville. She was from Rochester, by the way. And a few fellows were tinkering with, were trying to rebuild and get flying the Curtiss, an early Curtiss Wright flyer. I think it was supposed to be the earliest Curtiss Wright flyer, and they rebuilt it from the plans, and at this point, starting some tests on it. But my favorite photograph from the entire year of work at the Finger Lakes was Labor Day in Cohocton, Labor Day parade, and they had an annual tree sitting contest where youths from the community would string up in trees and sit there for 2 or 3 days to see who could endure it the longest. So that picture became the lead of the story on National Geographic. And there are more pictures in the show. And I hope you will get to see them. That's the end of my projection. Brett?
Well, Nathan, now we have the trouble of waiting 2.5 weeks for the show to open, but anticipation is the best part. So thank you so much. That was fantastic. And so let's see here. Looks like we're starting to get some questions come in, Nathan. And the first is, do you have any photos of Cayuga Lake?
Remind me yes, I'm sure I do have pictures of Cayuga. I don't recall which ones they are at this moment.
So Cayuga has Ithaca at the base of the lake.
Oh, yes.
Cornell University.
Yeah, so yeah, I spent the best part of a week in Cornell, at Cornell. I photographed the veterinarian school. People were also preparing for exams. So I photographed people studying in the library. They tried to find an angle of somebody studying with their dog because they had an enlightened policy that students could have their dogs with them. I'm totally in favor of that. I think everybody should always have dogs with them. And the vet school was one of the distinguished vet schools of the country. I don't have a single photograph from Cornell that I like. I think, I'm pretty sure the magazine did publish one in the article of a student with a dog in the library, but looking at it, it was, when I was editing it decades later, and trying to get my archive down to a manageable size, the criteria was not comprehensiveness as much as just what I liked.
Sure.
So I am sure other photographers have done a much better job since at Cornell than I did. Which, is a good opportunity to just say, that's one of the funny things about photography is that, you can try really hard and, with great effort and at times great expense and great cooperation and come up with absolutely nothing. And then at another time, like the woman who just stepped out of the kitchen in Vermont to call the people to dinner, something happens, it lasts 7 seconds, you take 2 frames, you've done no preparation, and you just, end up with a picture that is widely liked. I think the expectation now in professional photography is, if somebody is working on an assignment, first of all, that no publication and no producer is going to give their field people the amount of time and the amount of rope that we were given at the Geographic. Those budgets of the budgets of the days of mass media are gone. And if somebody is assigned now, they'd get, weeks to do something that we did in months, or maybe 2 weeks to do something we did in months. And a professional would be expected to go to Cornell and make a photograph, which means organizing a photograph.
Sure.
And which is what was common, would have been done in National Geographic in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s. But in the 70s, the emphasis, at least for my work, was authenticity and spontaneity. And I did not set up pictures. And sometimes I came up with nothing.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple more questions roll in here. Nathan, are you still actively shooting? If so, what type of work?
I'm not actively taking new pictures except family snapshots. We have one son. I got married when I left the Geographic. I got married another photographer, a wonderful a woman from Boston, and she is an excellent photographer. And we had a baby 20 years ago, who's now in college. So most of the pictures I've taken in the last 20 years are family snapshots, and most of them taken with an iPhone. But a couple of years ago, I got my first professional digital camera, a secondhand Leica M9, and have tried, and when we travel, I do little family collections of our vacation pictures and publish, little personal books and blurbs. So that's what I do. But I work with my photographs every day because I have this big archive, and it was very important to me over the last decade to organize it. What did I do between National Geographic and current life? As I was turning 40 and coming up on my completing my 19th year on the staff, I needed to take a sabbatical. I was just feeling like I was getting close to, had the potential for burnout. My last story, the editors wanted me to go off to photograph the Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, what were then the breakaway republics of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the falling apart of the Soviet Union, because I had just earlier done a story on democratic revolution or story on South Korea that included a democratic revolution that also was extremely violent. And so I was I was to go off and expect to do the same thing in the Soviet Union. But I didn't want to go back to the field for another year. And I chose to do a story on Pittsburgh, which would keep me close to home. And what I was interested in doing outside was, it was the very beginning of talk about digital imaging. National Geographic had a little project involving computerizing of picture library, and people were experimenting with digital imaging, but it was still, a film world. And I had the harebrained scheme that it might be possible to take digital images and put them in a computer and send them out on telephone lines. I didn't know enough to know that this would be very hard and very expensive. But I was able to get a high technology company in the Washington area interested in trying to build this. And we got funded by the Tribune Company in Chicago. And in 1993, we launched Picture Network International's as the first company to do a online picture library,
Wow.
which was the predecessor of Getty and Shutterstock, and in some ways you could say also the predecessor of all intellectual property sold online. We were one of the very first internet companies. We actually launched pre-internet and then moved to internet. And Kodak bought the company in 1998. And it was, so my 90s, in the 90s, I was almost an accidental internet entrepreneur. And then after that, we moved to New York, and I wanted to work in publishing and art field and internet. And New York seemed to be the place for the future. And I was recruited to be the director of Magnum Photos. And Magnum is a photo cooperative founded by famous photographers, Henri Cartier-Bresson and others, and synonymous with the best photojournalism in the world in the 20th century. So it was an honor to be the director there, and I was there for 3 years. And then after I left there, I focused on my archive and doing some other things to earn a living.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. Going back to the budget topic before, we had a question that came through. Did you get paid by the photograph or by your time spent shooting?
I was paid by the time. So we had, so the geographic staff had, there are three types of photographers that were contributing to the Geographic. There were freelance photographers who might do one story in their lifetime that was published in the Geographic, or might do one story a year for the Geographic. And then they had a photographic staff, and the photographic staff had a floor of the building under Bob Gilka. There is no photographic staff and has not been a photographic staff at National Geographic for 20 years. National Geographic today is owned by the Disney Corporation, and it's very different. The relationship between the Geographic today and the Geographic when I worked there is the relationship between Google and cuneiform tablets. It's just completely gone.
Wow.
So the National Geographic in most of the 20th century, at least through the middle of the 20th century, had a photographic staff. So these were staff like any other staff. But in the 1960s, Gilka and Bill Garrett made a concerted move to reduce the staff by attrition, and attrition on our staff meant a combination of retirement, volcanoes, airplane crashes, shark attacks, avalanches, various things that attrited the staff over time. and hiring people who were effectively worked like staff, but were not technically staff members. So the only difference was that as a contract photographer, I paid my own insurance, had no retirement, but I owned my photographs. My staff colleagues were covered as staff members and eventually retired, but they did not own their photographs.
Okay.
So it was advantageous to me to be a contract photographer. The contract photographers, not long after I left in 1991, and I left because I just needed to take a break. I thought it would be like a 1-year sabbatical to regroup and then go back to work, because I started working for the Geographic 2 days after I finished college. So I didn't have any other job skills, nothing else on my resume. I owned my photographs. My colleagues did not. So it worked out very satisfactorily. The IRS later, a few years later in the 90s, eliminated contract positions in many industries, including magazine photographers, because the IRS judged people like me as to be unbenefited employees, which we were. I liked that status, but anyway, that's a long answer to, should have been a good question.
That was great. Thank you. We're just a little over 6:30, but I see we've still got a good audience here. We'll try to squeeze in just 1 or 2 more questions here, and then we'll call it an evening.
Okay.
Being from outside the region, how did people treat you when you showed up wanting to photograph them?
People are usually, well, first of all, the people at Finger Lakes, I think, were very nice and friendly people. I think probably still that way. So up in Corning, as you know, a couple of weeks ago to work on the exhibit. But also there, again, I have this non-threatening demeanor that comes across, which is, I think is not an act. I mean, I don't intend to threaten people. And I'd like to think that I'm empathetic to the subjects that I photograph and try not to be, in most cases, to photograph people in a positive way. But there's also the element that I was on the photographic staff of National Geographic, and I had the sense that I was entitled to go anywhere I wanted and do anything I wanted because it was National Geographic. And that's a very archaic concept today, that any media in this, in our current woke world, the privilege of media and the privilege of a white man in media is appropriately questioned critically. And there's currently quite a bit of movement about critical questioning of how legitimate photographs by people like me, when we went to other countries, how legitimate were our pictures, because the people in the pictures, we were not giving agency to the people in the pictures. I think agency is a big term today. But in 1975 or throughout my career, that question wasn't coming up. I was there for National Geographic. I believed in the righteousness of the National Geographic mission. I guess I also believed at the time, and still do, the the concept of American exceptionalism and democracy. And I had a positive view towards the people. And you walk into a situation, and if you feel that way about yourself, people read it that way. If you are kind of sneaking around and nervous and don't feel entitled to photograph people, they'll pick up on that and push back on you. In my 20 years, shooting in the field for the Geographic, I've been shot at and stoned, but not regularly. Usually people were, pretty ready to let me enter whatever situation they were in, and then I would try to work without a flash and try not to manipulate the situation and to be the fly on the wall. When asked, as would often happen, at some point somebody would say, do you think we have enough now, don't we? That's enough, isn't it? You have your picture, we have enough? And of course the reply would be, I'm not really there yet. Could I come back also tomorrow?
Well, I think that's a perfect question to wrap things up tonight, Nathan. This was incredible, and I hope everybody that's tuned in tonight is excited to see your work on view at the museum at the end of the month. And thank you again, Nathan, for taking the time this evening to join us. And many thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.